Hello. It's really nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I wanted to get the ball rolling by probably trying to say something a bit challenging. And I want to discuss the dilemma faced by contemporary secularism in the UK and in Europe more broadly. Because I think in the past, things are pretty clear. Secularism was trying to combat oppressive and illiberal hegemony of Christianity, which resulted in the exclusion of those of other religions, or in the UK, or the wrong type of Christianity, from the exercise of state power, and where the law gave force to often illiberal teachings in areas like blasphemy, the status of women, or sexual morality. And here, see, there are two wrongs that secularists could combat there: the symbolic and substantive preference for one faith, and the promotion of illiberal principles in the name of that faith. Secularists didn't need to think about whether, or to choose between, to any degree, their commitment to either of those principles in advancing the secularist cause. But in contemporary Europe, things are more complicated. The symbolic precedence of Christianity continues in most countries, and particularly intensely in this country, either through having an official religion or just the persistence of collective arrangements like holidays or flags or things like that that have a Christian imprint. But on the other hand, the social and political influence of Christianity has fallen precipitously. At least in relation to mainstream churches like the Catholic Church or Church of England, their political ambitions, they're something of a shriveled dragon now. Most denominations have accepted that their religious teachings cannot directly form the basis of public policy, and even if they haven't, which sometimes, for instance, the Catholic Church has not, they realize that their ability to determine the voting behavior of their adherents is quite low. So Catholics are happy to put up with contraception or whatever. Now, the extent to which liberal values are compromised by religious teaching is also declined, particularly in relation to sexual morality. And the problem is that such threats as there are come then therefore not from the traditionally dominant forms of Christianity, but often from minority faiths whose worldview has been less formed by the kind of secular winds that buffeted European Christianity. In particular, in Europe, the largest non-Christian denomination is Islam. And unfortunately, life is not divided into very emotionally satisfying categories. It would be really great if the anti-secular movement was rich capitalist white men who also were conspiring against the workers and smoking cigars. In fact, the reality is that often people who suffer from disadvantage in one area also then have views that might cause people of concern in others. And this poses difficult dilemmas. If you think about secularism as having both the objective of a religiously neutral state and the protection of liberal values, should secularists concentrate on the neutrality of the state, the idea that the state should not be kind of having too many particular views or ways or an idea of the best way to live your life? Should the state be religiously neutral in removing symbolic residues of the influence of Christianity? Like, I flew in from Ireland yesterday on a plane which, like all Aer Lingus planes, is named after an Irish saint. My plane was actually Saint Ronan, which I kind of liked. But is that the kind of thing that should be, or St. Patrick's Day, Christmas as a national holiday, are those kind of things worth pursuing? Because given the formative influence of Christianity on national cultures, it's hard to think of any historically resonant symbols or arrangements that would be entirely religiously neutral. As the philosopher Thomas Nagel said, what is the view from nowhere or everywhere like? If the aim is to integrate minority populations, particularly those of liberal religious views, into a mainstream, is a culture shorn of any historically resident elements likely to be a viable or attractive thing to integrate into? The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has always said that a sustainable political community is not made up of the manifest of an international flight. It's not, it's more than that. There has to be some degree of cultural resonance. So should, on the other hand, then secularists concentrate on the idea of illiberal religion? Well, first, obviously, as I think was alluded to by our president, where does that leave liberal religions? Would secularists oppose a Quaker theocracy that was fair to everybody? Or in particularly, how should secularists react to the increasing tendency in Europe to have particular political values set out as an element of national identity? I was in a nursery for 2-year-olds which has fundamental British values on the wall. It says, we tolerate people of other religions, we respect free speech. I mean, the children can't speak yet. But it is also true that those values are a characteristic of British society. But that does have a degree of tension with the traditional liberal commitment to narrowing the scope of what the state, the ideological particularity of the state. If secularists decide that the active promotion or the increase in the ideological nature of the state is inappropriate, are we willing to see society become ever more illiberal? The big change, I think, in recent times is the confidence that those who are secularists and liberals, that the future belonged to them is going. And our president alluded to this again. I think until very recently, the attitude was a level playing field, in the end, results in liberal victory. And I don't think people believe that anymore. And I think if you look across Europe, you see a rake of policies that have ever more coercive attempts through policies, integration tests, citizenship exams, to try and ensure that people who are being naturalized or migrant communities adopt liberal values. And that is such an indication of a loss of confidence. Until a couple of decades ago, if you ask someone in the 60s or 70s, no one would have even thought that was possibly necessary. The French scholar Olivier Roy has written about how nobody was worried when a grandmother from the Rif Mountains wore her headscarf on coming to France in the 1960s or 70s, but when her French educated and raised granddaughter adopts the hijab or niqab, then people get worried because it raises questions about who the future will belong to. And secularists and liberals were certain in the 1990s that the future was ours. We thought that a level playing field means we win. So we liked an ideologically neutral state. We thought it would let us win, as well as being ethically correct. But secularism today, therefore, I think, faces very complicated questions about its objectives. How much should it endorse the active promotion of liberal values by the state, even to the extent of sometimes penalizing those with non-liberal views? How far should it be hunting down residual relics of Christian influence over state symbols and arrangements? The fact is that secularism actually was not originally a liberal ideology. It was about coexistence. 500 years ago, it came out of the wars of religion, and it was a method of coexistence, not liberal values. But the genius of secularism was by allowing people with a liberal religious views to sign up to liberal political outcomes, it provided both coexistence and liberal values. That has really worked up to now, partly because Christianity has been on the decline in Europe for 150 years. Whether that model keeps going with other faiths in Europe is not certain, and I think secularism will have to think hard about the different ways in which its commitments to neutrality and to liberal values are pulling it. So, thank you.